In the winter of 1873, the German immigrant community of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, whispered about 11-year-old Emma Richter in hushed, fearful tones, because this pale, quiet child could calculate the day of the week for any date in human history within seconds, memorize entire conversations word for word after hearing them just once, and recite the precise number of steps between any two buildings in her neighborhood. But when Emma began using her remarkable abilities to reveal buried secrets, predict deadly accidents, and recite intimate details of crimes that supposedly no living person had witnessed, the community's amazement turned to terror, and by spring, 3 men would be dead. A family would flee in the night, and Emma Richter herself would vanish without a trace, leaving behind only a leather journal filled with numbers that no one dared to decode. Before we continue with this chilling story, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we bring you the most haunting historical mysteries every week, and let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from, since these stories happened in communities just like yours, closer to home than you might think. But what the residents of Brewery Town didn't realize was that Emma's gift would expose a web of lies, betrayal, and murder that had been carefully hidden for nearly a decade, and that her mathematical precision would become their community's most terrifying nightmare. Milwaukee's German Quarter in 1873 was a bustling enclave of red brick breweries, modest wooden homes, and the constant sound of German voices mixing with English in the crisp Wisconsin air, where nearly 8,000 German immigrants had built their own little Bavaria along the shores of Lake Michigan, complete with beer gardens, traditional bakeries, and the familiar rhythms of old-world life transplanted to American soil, while the men worked in the breweries like Schlitz, Best, and dozens of smaller operations that made Milwaukee famous, and their wives tended gardens that yielded the same vegetables their grandmothers had grown in the Rhineland. Heinrich and Greta Richter had arrived from Bavaria in 1861 with dreams of prosperity and their infant daughter Emma, and Heinrich found steady work as a brewmaster at the Kellner Brewery, while Greta took in laundry and mending to supplement their income, working by candlelight long after Emma had been put to bed in their small but tidy home on Galena Street. And the Richters were unremarkable in every way except for their daughter, who had been born during the harsh Atlantic crossing, 3 weeks premature and so small that the ship's doctor doubted she would survive the journey, but survive she did, though she remained slight and pale with enormous gray eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with unsettling intensity. As a toddler, Emma rarely cried or demanded attention, content to sit quietly in corners, watching and listening as the adult world unfolded around her. And by age 4, Emma's parents began to notice something unusual when she could recite entire conversations she had overheard days earlier, complete with the precise inflections and accents of the speakers. And she counted everything, including the number of stitches in her mother's embroidery, the steps from their front door to the bakery, and the exact time between the brewery whistles that marked the beginning and end of each workday. So when Heinrich taught her basic arithmetic, she absorbed mathematical concepts with frightening speed, solving problems in her head faster than he could work them out on paper. The German community initially viewed Emma's abilities with a mixture of pride and unease, with old Mrs. Brennan, who claimed to remember witch trials in her grandmother's stories, crossing herself whenever Emma's calculating gray eyes fixed on her, but Father Koller, the stout Bavarian priest who served their small Catholic parish, declared Emma's gifts to be a blessing from God, a child chosen to demonstrate divine wisdom in their New World community. The winter of 1872 had been particularly harsh, with temperatures dropping so low that Lake Michigan froze solid for the first time in a generation, and it was during this isolated winter that Emma's abilities began to take on a darker character, though no one yet understood what was coming, as Emma had developed the habit of sitting by the small window in their kitchen, watching the neighbors go about their daily routines with the same intense focus she applied to mathematical problems, and she began to notice patterns, not just in numbers, but in human behavior, observing that Mr. Kruger always walked to the brewery by the same route, taking exactly 247 steps, except on Wednesdays when he took a different path that required 284 steps, and Mrs. Fisher hung her laundry in a specific sequence. But when her husband worked late at the mill, she changed the order completely, and these observations might have been dismissed as the quirks of an unusual child, except that Emma began to vocalize her findings in ways that made the adults increasingly uncomfortable. The transformation from curiosity to dread began on a gray February morning in 1873, when Emma was sitting at the kitchen table, methodically eating her breakfast, while her mother prepared her father's lunch pail, and she suddenly looked up and announced, "Mr. Dietrich will not come home from the brewery today. He will die at exactly 14 minutes past 2 o'clock." Which nearly caused Greta to drop the tin pail she was holding as she exclaimed, "Emma, mein Gott, what a terrible thing to say. Why would you think such a thing?" But Emma's gray eyes remained fixed on her mother's face with that unsettling intensity as she explained, "He has been drinking from the small brown bottle for 17 days. Yesterday he drank 3 times more than usual. His steps were uneven. 251 instead of his normal 244. And when people change their patterns by more than 10%, something significant happens within 72 hours. Mr. Dietrich's pattern changed by 12%, so the calculation is simple." Heinrich, who had been putting on his heavy wool coat, stopped and stared at his daughter because Jan Dietrich was indeed a drinker, but no more than half the men in the German quarter, and the idea that Emma had been counting his steps and tracking his drinking habits was disturbing enough. But her calm, mathematical certainty about his death sent a chill through both parents that had nothing to do with the Wisconsin winter. So Heinrich said firmly, "You must not say such things, Emma. It's not proper for a child to speak of death." And Emma simply nodded and returned to her breakfast. But her parents exchanged worried glances over her bent head because they had grown accustomed to their daughter's unusual observations. But this felt different, darker, and more specific than her typical mathematical pronouncements. At precisely 14 minutes past 2 that afternoon, Jan Dietrich collapsed in the brewery's malt room, and the official cause of death was heart failure brought on by what Dr. Muller determined to be chronic alcohol poisoning, with the brewery workers who found him noting that he had been acting strangely for weeks, drinking more heavily than usual and showing signs of severe anxiety. But what truly unsettled them was the timing, because Emma Richter's prediction had been accurate to the minute. Word of Emma's grim prophecy spread through the German quarter like smoke from a chimney fire, with some dismissing it as coincidence, but others remembering the pale girl with the calculating eyes and beginning to wonder what else she might have observed during her silent vigils at the kitchen window. And the Richter family found themselves the subject of whispered conversations and sideways glances when they walked to church or visited the market. Father Koller, who had previously praised Emma's gifts as divine, now seemed less certain, and when Heinrich approached him after Sunday Mass, seeking guidance about his daughter's disturbing prediction, the priest's jovial demeanor had been replaced by something approaching concern as he said, "Heinrich, my friend, perhaps it would be best if young Emma spent less time watching the neighbors and more time with her prayers, because the Lord gives us gifts, yes, but sometimes the devil can twist even the most innocent abilities toward darker purposes." This suggestion troubled Heinrich deeply, since he had always been a practical man, more concerned with the science of brewing than the mysteries of faith. But even he could not dismiss the unsettling accuracy of Emma's prediction. So that evening he sat his daughter down for a serious conversation, asking, "Emma, you must tell me the truth. How did you know about Mr. Dietrich?" And Emma looked at her father with those enormous gray eyes, her expression as calm and analytical as always, as she replied, "I watch, I count, I remember. Mr. Dietrich's behavior changed in predictable ways when someone increases their alcohol consumption by 37% over a 17-day period while simultaneously reducing their food intake by approximately 20%. Cardiac stress becomes inevitable, and I calculated the most probable time of failure based on his age, weight, and observed symptoms." Henrik felt his blood run cold because his 11-year-old daughter was speaking like a physician or something far more troubling, and when he asked, "But Emma, how could you know all these details about Mr. Dietrich's eating and drinking?" she responded matter-of-factly. "I observe everything, Papa. Every day, every person, every pattern. Would you like me to tell you about the other calculations I've made?" But Henrik quickly shook his head because he did not want to know what else his daughter had calculated about their neighbors' lives and deaths, and as he tucked Emma into bed that night, he could. Henrik had heard enough, and that evening, after Emma was asleep, he spoke seriously with his wife about their daughter's increasingly troubling behavior, saying, "Greta, this cannot continue. Emma is becoming unnatural. Children should not observe such things, and they certainly should not speak of them so coldly." And Greta nodded, her hands trembling as she mended one of Henrik's work shirts, replying, "I'm frightened, Henrik, not of Emma, but of what people will think. Already the neighbors look at us strangely. Mrs. Brennan crossed the street yesterday when she saw me coming, and Father Collar, he has not visited us since Jan's death." Their fears proved justified when 3 days later, Emma made another of her mathematical announcements while she was helping her mother prepare dinner, suddenly stopping her potato peeling and looking up with that familiar calculating expression to announce, "Mrs. Weber will be discovered tomorrow at 11 in the morning. Her husband will find her with Mr. Kellner in the brewery office. There will be violence," which caused Greta to drop her paring knife as she exclaimed, "Emma 9, you must not say such things." But Emma continued with the same mathematical certainty she applied to her arithmetic lessons, explaining, "Mrs. Weber has been arriving at the brewery 7 minutes earlier each week for 6 weeks. Mr. Kellner has been staying 33 minutes later each day, and tomorrow Mr. Weber will return from his delivery route 47 minutes early because his horse is developing lameness in her left front leg. I have observed her gait deteriorating for 11 days. So the convergence of these 3 variables makes discovery inevitable." Heinrich, who had been listening from the doorway, felt his chest tighten with dread, because his daughter was not just observing their neighbors, she was predicting their futures with terrifying accuracy. And when he asked, "Emma, how do you know about Mr. Weber's horse?" she replied, "I count her steps when she passes our house. On March 1st, she favored her right legs 53% of the time. Today, it was 68%. Tomorrow, the lameness will be severe enough to slow the delivery route by 47 minutes, causing Mr. Weber to return early." The next day unfolded exactly as Emma had calculated when Wilhelm Weber discovered his wife Anna in a compromising position with brewery owner Ernst Kellner. And the confrontation that followed left Kellner with a broken nose and 3 cracked ribs, while Anna was beaten so severely that Dr. Muller had to be summoned, and the scandal rocked the tight-knit German community. But what disturbed people even more was the growing realization that little Emma Richter had somehow predicted the entire sequence of events. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood that the pale girl with the mathematical mind had not only predicted Jan Dietrich's death, but had also foreseen the Weber-Kellner scandal with unsettling precision, and people began to whisper about the strange child who sat at her window, watching and calculating and somehow knowing things that no child should know. The Richter family found themselves increasingly isolated as former friends avoided them at church. Children were forbidden from playing near their house, and even the shopkeepers in the German quarter began to treat them with barely concealed suspicion, while Heinrich's position at the brewery became tenuous because his fellow workers viewed him with unease, and Ernst Kellner, still recovering from his beating, made it clear that the Richter family was no longer welcome at company social events. But Emma seemed oblivious to the growing hostility around her as she continued her daily observations, her mathematical mind processing data and calculating probabilities with mechanical precision. And she began keeping a leather journal, filling its pages with numbers, dates, and observations that her parents dared not read, because the sight of their 11-year-old daughter bent over her calculations, writing in neat columns of figures, filled them with a dread they could not name. As winter gave way to spring, the isolation deepened, and the German quarter that had once felt like home now seemed hostile and threatening. So Heinrich began to consider the unthinkable. Leaving Milwaukee, abandoning the life they had built, and starting over somewhere far from the whispers and the fear and the terrible accuracy of their daughter's predictions. But Emma was not finished with her calculations because the worst was yet to come, and her mathematical mind had already begun processing the data that would lead to the darkest secrets of all. As April arrived in Milwaukee, bringing with it the first tentative warmth after the brutal winter, Emma's journal grew thicker with her precise notations, and the leather-bound book had become her constant companion as she filled its pages with increasingly complex calculations that went far beyond simple mathematics, while her parents caught glimpses of charts. The accuracy of Emma's prediction down to the exact minute sent shockwaves through the German quarter, and Heinrich's attempt to warn Zimmermann had been witnessed by several brewery workers. So word spread quickly that Emma had predicted not just the fire, but its precise timing and consequences, which transformed the community's unease into open fear. And the Richter family found themselves completely ostracized. But for Emma, the fire was simply another data point to be recorded in her journal as she noted the correlation between her prediction and the actual event, made adjustments to her calculations based on the observed variables, and began processing new patterns with the same mechanical precision that had made her prediction possible in the first place, and the worst part was that she was not finished calculating. The days following the Zimmermann fire transformed the German quarter into a place of whispered fears and sideways glances because Emma's prediction had been too precise, too detailed, and too accurate to be dismissed as coincidence, and three families, the Bronzes, the Kohlas, and the Steiners, had lost their homes in the blaze, so the community was struggling to house the displaced families while trying to process the unsettling reality of Emma's mathematical prophecies. Heinrich found his position at the brewery had become untenable because his fellow workers avoided him. Conversations stopped when he entered a room, and Ernst Kellner, still bearing the marks of Wilhelm Weber's attack, made it clear that the Richter family's presence was no longer welcome in any brewery's social functions. While the mathematical precision of Emma's predictions had transformed their daughter from a curiosity into something the community feared to name. Emma herself seemed unaware of the growing hostility around her as she continued her daily observations, filling page after page of her leather journal with calculations that grew increasingly complex and disturbing, and she had begun creating what appeared to be probability matrices, tracking multiple variables simultaneously and generating predictions that extended weeks into the future. Greta found herself afraid to look at her daughter's journal, terrified of what calculations Emma might be making about their own family or neighbors, because the child who had once been her greatest joy had become a source of constant anxiety, and Emma's matter-of-fact discussions of human tragedy, her clinical observations about people's most private behaviors, and her mechanical processing of information that should have evoked emotional responses, all contributed to a growing sense that something fundamental had been lost or damaged in her daughter's mind. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in late April when Emma was sitting at her usual place by the kitchen window, watching the street activity with her characteristic intensity. And she suddenly looked up at her mother with those calculating gray eyes, saying, "Mama, there is something wrong with the pattern today. which caused Greta, who was preparing bread for baking, to feel her hands begin to tremble as she asked, "What do you mean, Emma?" And Emma consulted her journal, flipping through pages of numerical notations with practiced efficiency, and explained, "Every Tuesday for 11 weeks, Mrs. Brennan has walked to the rectory at exactly 3:15, but today she left her house at 2:47 and walked toward the river instead. Her behavior indicates significant distress because her step length decreased by 12% and her breathing pattern was irregular, which suggests she is planning something final." The clinical way Emma discussed Mrs. Brennan's apparent suicidal intentions filled Greta with horror, and she protested, "Emma, you must not speak of such things. Mrs. Brennan is a good woman. She would never." But Emma interrupted with the same tone she might use to discuss the weather, stating, "The mathematical probability is 87%. People who dramatically alter established behavioral patterns while displaying physical signs of distress typically execute irreversible decisions within 4 hours of the pattern change, and Mrs. Brennan's pattern changed 43 minutes ago." Greta felt the world tilting around her because the realization that her 11-year-old daughter was calmly predicting a neighbor's suicide with mathematical precision was more than she could bear. So she dropped her bread dough and ran to find Hinrich, who was in their small garden behind the house trying to find some normalcy in the simple act of preparing soil for spring planting. And she called out, "Hinrich, you must come quickly. Emma says Mrs. Brennan is going to harm herself. We must do something." Hinrich looked at his wife's terrified face and felt the familiar dread that had become their constant companion, and they found Emma still sitting by the window, making additional notations in her journal as if recording a scientific observation rather than pre-die.